So, you got your bees through their first winter. First off, huge congratulations. That is a major milestone for any beekeeper. But here's the crazy part. That was just the warm-up. Now we're going to dive into what I call the second-year spring gauntlet, a time that's so critical and honestly so misunderstood that it really determines the success of your entire year.
I know, it sounds completely backward, doesn't it? You'd think once the weather starts warming up, the worst is over. But for a honeybee colony, that transition from winter into spring is absolutely packed with hidden dangers that can catch even a seasoned beekeeper completely by surprise. So let's jump right into it. Section 1, the winter to spring gauntlet. We're going to uncover exactly why this time of year can be so dangerous.
Check this out, because it's a total paradox. More colonies actually starve and die in late winter and early spring than in the dead of winter. So why is that? Well, deep inside that hive, the queen has already started her work again, sometimes as early as January. She's laying eggs, that family is growing, and they start burning through their honey stores at an incredible rate. They can literally run out of food just weeks before the first flowers even think about blooming.
Yeah, that hive is anything but sleepy during this time. On any warm day, you'll see bees taking what are called cleansing flights and carrying out the bees that didn't make it through the winter. But all this activity is a real double-edged sword. As that brood nest gets bigger and bigger, a sudden late cold snap can force the cluster of bees to contract to stay warm. And when that happens, they might abandon the brood on the edges, which then freezes. We call that chilled brood, and it is a major setback for the colony's buildup.
With the risk of starvation being so high, the obvious question is, what can we do? How do we help them bridge that dangerous food gap? Well, that's exactly what our next section is all about, fueling the colony's engine. And the solution is something we call supplemental feeding. Now, this isn't about making the bees lazy or dependent. Think of it as a lifeline. We're just providing a stand-in for nectar to give them the raw energy they need to raise that next generation and just survive until the dandelions and other flowers finally take over. Okay, this is super important. It's not just that you feed, but how and where you feed. In cold weather, bees huddle together for warmth at the very top of the hive. If you put food at the entrance, you're forcing a single bee to make this long, cold, and often fatal journey. So the absolute key is to place the food, whether it's a syrup feeder or a hard candy board, right above the cluster, inside the hive. That way, they barely have to move to get to it.
And of course, what you feed them is just as critical. You want to stick to plain white sugar. That's because it's mostly sucrose, which is chemically almost identical to flower nectar. Stay away from brown sugar, raw sugar, or molasses. They all have stuff in them that bees can't digest, and it can make them really sick. And here's a huge warning. Never, ever feed your bees honey from the grocery store. It could contain spores of nasty diseases like American foul brood that could completely wipe out your hive.
So let's say you've successfully fed them through that critical gap. You've solved one problem, and congratulations, you've immediately created another one. So let's talk about how to manage the incredible population boom that comes next.
The moment the first real pollen starts coming in from trees like maples and willows, it's like someone flips a switch inside the hive. Pollen is their protein source, and it's pure fuel for making more bees. The more pollen they bring in, the more eggs the queen lays, and that colony's population just starts to explode. All of a sudden, that hive that felt kind of empty all winter is getting very crowded.
A classic way to manage this sudden crowding is a technique called the spring reversal. See, over the winter, the bees naturally move upwards. So by spring, the queen and all the brood are in the top box with a big empty box underneath. By simply swapping their positions, you put that brood nest back down on the bottom. This gives the queen a whole new space to move up and lay in, and it encourages the workers to store all that incoming nectar in the top box, which is exactly what they want to do. But, and this is a huge but, before you even think about reversing, you have to open that hive and check the frames. If the queen has laid eggs and there's brood across both boxes, do not reverse them. Splitting the brood nest like that is a recipe for disaster. If a cold snap hits, the cluster of bees won't be able to cover both sections, and you'll end up with a ton of dead, chilled brood. When in doubt, it's better to just leave it alone.
All right, so all of this explosive growth and this crowding, it all leads to one inevitable, perfectly natural conclusion for the bees. And that's our next topic, understanding the swarm instinct.
I absolutely love this quote because it's your first major clue. When you open a hive and you start seeing capped drone brood, those are the male bees, and their cells look like little bullets sticking out,
You know the colony is thinking about swarming. See, the bees are smart. They won't bother raising new queens until they know for sure that there are mature drones around for them to mate with.
So this is a huge mental shift you have to make as a beekeeper. A swarm is not a failure on your part. In fact, it's a sign of a really healthy, thriving colony that's doing exactly what nature designed it to do. The old queen just takes off with about half the bees to start a new home, and she leaves a new virgin queen behind to take over the original hive. It's just how honeybees reproduce.
And you might be wondering, well, when does all this happen? It really depends on where you live. As you can see, swarm season starts as early as March, way down in the deep south, and it basically moves northward like a wave, hitting its peak in June or even July in states like New York. The timing is tied directly to when the main nectar flow starts in each region.
Now, just because it's natural doesn't mean we want to lose half our bees, and, with them, half of our potential honey crop. So how do we manage this incredibly powerful instinct? Let's get into how to prevent a swarm by, well, basically becoming the swarm yourself.
We do this by making a split. And a split is exactly what it sounds like. It's an artificial swarm that you control. You're giving the bees what they want. You're satisfying that natural urge to divide and reproduce, but you're doing it on your terms in your own bee yard instead of trying to catch them from the top of a 30-foot tree.
The process is really fascinating. First, you have to find the queen, which is usually the hardest part. Then you move her and the frame she's on into a brand new box. The trick is to give this new little colony everything it needs to get started. Frames of honey and pollen for food, and frames with brood in all stages of development. Finally, and this is key, you gently shake in extra nurse bees from the original hive. Because they're young, they'll stay put and get right to work taking care of their queen.
Okay, so you've fed them, you've managed their space, and you've prevented them from swarming away. All of this hard work you've put in all spring has one ultimate goal: getting your hive perfectly ready for the main honey flow. I want you to remember this number. Just this one number, 45. It is the single most important number if you want to maximize your honey harvest.
So why 45? Well, it all comes down to bee math. It takes 21 days for a worker bee to go from an egg to a fully grown adult bee. But she doesn't start foraging right away. She spends another 3 weeks or so doing chores inside the hive. So, if you want a bee to be at her peak foraging age right when the nectar starts pouring in, the egg that she came from had to be laid about 45 days before that.
And this brings us to the grand finale, the whole point of mastering the spring gauntlet. All your spring management is designed to do one thing: arrive at the main honey flow with a single, massive, unswarmed colony. A hive that is absolutely bursting at the seams with forager-age bees, all driven by a healthy, productive queen. And that's what matters, because one massive hive is way more efficient and will produce significantly more honey than 2 smaller hives combined.
By feeding, by reversing, and by splitting at just the right time, you've skillfully navigated the most challenging part of the entire beekeeping year. You've managed their needs, you've worked with their instincts, and you've set the stage for success. So the only question left is, after all that work, is your hive now ready for the flow?